They said Alexander Hyun didn't have a heart. In Seoul's underworld, they called him the Ice King, a man who traded lives for power without hesitation. So when he forced a 19-year-old girl into marriage, no one questioned it. Marvis was supposed to be just another victim, a broken bride, a forgotten name. But that night, everything went wrong. Because when the doors of the bridal suite closed and the clock struck midnight, Alexander Hyun didn't touch her. He dropped to his knees. And in that moment, the most feared man in the city did something far more dangerous than violence. He chose her. What happened in that room didn't just change their marriage. It ignited a war that would burn the entire underworld to the ground. And Marvis, she wasn't his victim anymore. She became the only person he was willing to die for. The night Alexander Hyun dropped to his knees was the moment everything started to fall apart. By morning, the entire underworld knew. The Ice King, the man who feared nothing, had chosen a woman over power. And in his world, that was a death sentence. Now, enemies are rising from the shadows. Allies are turning into traitors. Caught between a man who would burn the world for her and a past that refuses to let her go. Marvis is about to discover a terrifying truth. Loving a mafia king doesn't make you powerful. It makes you a target. And this time, she's not just fighting for love. She's fighting to survive. The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the cold metallic tang of a city made of steel. Alexander Hyun stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection staring back at him like a stranger. At 46, his face was a map of hard choices and silent victories. He adjusted his cufflinks, the silk fabric brushing against the dark ink that crawled up his wrists, tattoos that marked him as the undisputed king of the Seoul underworld. To the world, he was a monster in a three-piece suit. But inside this room, the monster was breathless. He turned away from the sprawling lights of the city to look at the bed. There lay Marvis. At 19, she was a vision of innocence that he had dragged into his den of lions. Her dark skin looked like polished mahogany against the white silk sheets, and her breathing was rhythmic, peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm raging in Alexander's chest. He had forced this marriage, signed the papers with a cold hand, and claimed her before his enemies could. He told himself it was for her safety. He told himself he was her shield. But as he took a silent step toward her, his hand, usually steady enough to hold a weapon without a flinch, began to tremble. Marvis was unlike any woman he had ever met. She wasn't just beautiful, she was weird in a way that fascinated him. She saw beauty in the cracks of the sidewalk and spent hours talking to the birds on the balcony. She didn't look at him with the terror everyone else did. Instead, she looked at him with a bold, questioning curiosity that made him feel seen for the first time in decades. She was the moon in his midnight sky, glowing with a light he didn't deserve. The guilt sat in his stomach like a heavy lead weight. He had stolen her youth to pay for his sins. He had bound her to a man who lived in the shadows, making her a target for every bullet meant for him. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek, but he pulled back. He was a predator, and she was the only thing in this world he couldn't bring himself to break. Outside, the sirens wailed in the distance, a reminder of the violent world waiting for him at dawn. But here, in the golden glow of the lamp, Alexander realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't just married her to protect her. He had married her because he was starving for the warmth she carried. He was the king of a blood-soaked empire, yet he would trade every crown he owned just to see her smile at him, not out of fear, but out of choice. The war for her heart had begun, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Hyun didn't know if he was strong enough to win. The silence of the penthouse was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of a night that no one else would ever understand. To the streets of Seoul, the story was simple. The ruthless Alexander Hyun had taken a young bride to show his dominance. The rumors in the underworld whispered of a cold, transactional night where power was exerted and a young girl's spirit was crushed. But as Alexander walked down the long, dimly lit hallway, the shadows seemed to whisper the real truth. The memory of that wedding night hung in the air like the smoke of a guttering candle. He remembered entering the bridal suite with his jaw set and his heart like flint. He had played the role of the monster for so long that he didn't know how to be anything else. He had expected to find Marvis trembling in the corner, weeping for her lost freedom. Instead, he had found a queen. Marvis had been standing by the window, her wedding veil discarded on the floor like a fallen cloud. When he approached, she didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She stood her ground, her dark eyes burning with a fire that made his own strength feel like a brittle mask. "Are you going to hurt me, Alexander?" she had asked, her voice steady and bold. He hadn't answered. He couldn't. "Everyone fears you," she continued, taking a step closer until the scent of her vanilla perfume filled his senses. "But I think you're the one who is afraid. I think you're terrified that someone might actually love the man behind the ink. Tell me, are you brave enough to be loved, or can you only handle being feared?" Those words had shattered him more than any bullet ever could. The walls he had built over 46 years crumbled in an instant. That night, the world's most dangerous man had done the unthinkable. He hadn't reached for her out of lust or power. Instead, he had fallen to his knees, his forehead resting against her shoulder as the weight of 1,000 sins finally broke him. He had wept for the lives he had taken, for the childhood he had lost, and for the lonely throne he sat upon. And Marvis, she hadn't mocked him. She had simply placed her warm, gentle hands on his head, holding him while the monster bled out and the man was born. That vulnerability was their secret, a hidden hook buried deep in both their hearts. It was a bond more permanent than the ink on his skin and more binding than the marriage certificate in his safe. The world saw a captive and a captor, but in the quiet of the night, Alexander knew the truth. He was the one who had been rescued, and he would burn the entire city to the ground before he let that secret, or that woman, slip through his fingers. The piece inside the penthouse was a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful to look at but ready to shatter at the slightest vibration. Outside those reinforced walls, the city of Seoul was humming with a different kind of energy. The Park Syndicate, Alexander's oldest and most bitter rivals, were watching. They saw the way the Ice King now hurried home. They saw the way his eyes softened when he looked at the balcony. To them, Alexander hadn't found a wife. He had found an Achilles heel. They thought his love was a leak in his armor, not realizing that a man with a world to protect is 10 times more lethal than a man with nothing to lose. Inside the mansion, Marvis moved like a spark of light through a tomb of cold marble. She wore the white silk gowns Alexander provided, dresses that cost more than most people earned in a decade, but she didn't feel like a billionaire's bride. She felt like a storm bird trapped in a silver cage. She was 19, but her eyes held a wisdom that didn't miss a single detail. She noticed how the shadows in the hallway had grown teeth. The number of guards standing outside their bedroom had doubled overnight. She heard the low, urgent murmurs of men in black suits whispering into their sleeves. Most of all, she noticed Alexander. Every time he prepared to leave for business, he lingered at the door. His hand would rest on the handle for a second too long, his shoulders tense, as if he were memorizing her face for a final time. The cold, ruthless boss was being eaten alive by a protective instinct that bordered on madness. One evening, the tension finally snapped. The sun was setting, bleeding crimson streaks across the sky, mirroring the violence Marvis felt brewing in the air. Alexander was checking his sidearm, his face a mask of stone, when Marvis stepped into his path. Her dark skin glowed under the chandelier, making her look like a goddess of justice. "You're suffocating me, Alexander," she said, her voice cutting through the silent room like a blade. He didn't look up, his fingers busy with the brass casing of a bullet. "I'm keeping you alive, Marvis." "No," she challenged, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You're locking me away because you're scared. You've surrounded me with walls and guns, but you've forgotten to let me breathe. This isn't protection, it's a funeral for a woman who isn't dead yet." Alexander finally looked at her, his dark eyes swirling with a mixture of agony and possessiveness. He wanted to scream that he couldn't lose her, that the world outside was full of monsters just like him. But the bold look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't a porcelain doll to be kept on a shelf. She was his partner, and the storm wasn't just coming for him anymore, it was coming for both of them. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence after Marvis's challenge. The only sound was the distant hum of the city and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Alexander didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His skin was rough, a stark contrast to her soft, dark palm. He moved his thumb slowly, tracing the knuckles of her hand with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man who commanded legions of killers. "I would rather you hate me in a golden cage than weep over my grave," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry earth. He wasn't looking at her as a boss or a captor. He was looking at her as a man standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified that the wind might finally blow him over. The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. He was admitting his greatest fear, not the loss of his empire or his life, but the loss of her. Marvis didn't pull her hand away. She felt the raw, jagged edges of his soul through that small touch. She realized then that Alexander Hyun wasn't just protective, he was drowning. Every rule he broke, every guard he placed, and every secret he kept was a desperate attempt to keep his head above water. She was the only thing keeping him tethered to the shore. Slowly, she leaned in. She didn't stop until her forehead was resting against his. In that intimate space, the world outside ceased to exist. She could smell him, the sophisticated scent of expensive woodsy cologne mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder that clung to his clothes like a second skin. It was the scent of a man who lived in the crosshairs of death. She closed her eyes, feeling the heat of him. She wasn't afraid of the Ice King or the tattoos that marked him as a criminal. She was afraid of the profound, ancient sadness she felt radiating from his body. It was a loneliness so deep it felt like an ocean. In that moment of shared breath, Marvis made a choice. She wasn't just a girl caught in a mafia war anymore. She was his anchor. She realized that if she turned her back on him, if she let her anger at the cage outweigh her love for the man, he would vanish into the darkness forever. He wouldn't just become a monster, he would become a ghost. "I don't hate you, Alexander," she murmured into the space between them. "But don't ask me to watch you die from behind a glass wall." He gripped her hand tighter, a silent vow passing between them. He wouldn't let her go, and she wouldn't let him fall. But as the shadows of the evening stretched across the floor, they both knew that a vow of love was the most dangerous weapon of all in a world built on hate. The grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen tears, casting a brilliant glow over the powerful men and women who governed the city's shadows. This gala was supposed to be a ceasefire, a night where the Park Syndicate and the Hyun Empire laid down their weapons to toast to a fragile peace. Alexander walked through the crowd with Marvis on his arm, his expression a mask of cold, unreadable granite. Marvis looked breathtaking, her dark skin radiating against an emerald silk gown that flowed like liquid fire as she moved. Despite the music and the clinking of champagne flutes, the air felt electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. Alexander's hand never left the small of Marvis's back. He wasn't greeting associates, he was scanning the balconies. He was a wolf among vipers, and his instincts were screaming. Suddenly, a tiny, crimson speck of light appeared on the ivory fabric covering Marvis's chest. It was a sniper's dot, a silent herald of death. Alexander didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. Before the human brain could even register the threat, he lunged. With a roar of primal protection, he spun Marvis behind his broad frame, shielding her body with his own. A split second later, the sharp crack of a high-powered rifle shattered the glass of a nearby window. The bullet hissed through the air, grazing Alexander's shoulder and tearing through his bespoke suit jacket. Blood, hot and dark, instantly began to soak the charcoal fabric. Chaos erupted. People screamed, diving under tables as the peace evaporated into a nightmare of gunfire and shattered crystal. Alexander's guards moved in a synchronized blur, weapons drawn, but Alexander didn't look at the shooter. He didn't look at the exits. His entire world had shrunk down to the girl standing trembling in his shadow. "Are you hurt? Marvis, look at me," he barked, his voice raw with a terror he had never shown to any enemy. His cold eyes searched her face, desperate for any sign of a wound. Marvis wasn't cowering. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't filled with the fear of a victim. She looked at the crimson stains spreading across his shoulder, and a new kind of fire ignited in her soul. She reached out, her fingers stained red as she grabbed the lapels of his bloodied jacket. "I'm fine, Alexander, but you're bleeding," she cried out, her voice steady and fierce. In that heartbeat, the power shifted. The Ice King was wounded, and the innocent girl became the anchor. As bullets flew and his men fought to clear the room, Marvis reached up and tore a long strip of white lace from her designer veil. With steady hands, she pressed the fabric against his wound, her eyes locked onto his. She wasn't just his wife anymore, she was his sanctuary. In the middle of the war, she was the only one brave enough to keep him whole. The heavy steel door of the underground bunker hissed shut, sealing out the echoes of the sirens and the chaos of the city above. The air here was cool and smelled of old paper and ozone. Alexander leaned against a concrete pillar, his face pale from blood loss, though his gaze remained fixed on Marvis. He moved toward a hidden safe in the wall, his movements stiff but determined. With a trembling hand, he pulled out a thick leather ledger and held it out to her. "Open it," he commanded softly. Marvis took the book, expecting to see a list of illegal deals, names of enemies, or the dark accounting of a mafia empire. Instead, her eyes widened as she scanned the pages. It wasn't a ledger of crimes. It was a massive trust fund, ironclad and untraceable, established in her name weeks ago. The numbers were staggering, enough to buy a new life anywhere in the world 10 times over. "If I don't make it through tonight," Alexander said, his voice a low rasp, "this is your exit. You are now the wealthiest woman in Asia. You can run. You can change your name, disappear to Europe, and never have to look over your shoulder at a shadow again." He looked at her, expecting relief or perhaps a calculated glimmer of greed. He had given her the ultimate gift for a captive, the key to her cage. But Marvis didn't look at the numbers. She looked at him. Without a word, she gripped the edges of the heavy parchment and ripped it down the middle. She tore it again and again until the pieces fluttered to the bunker floor like useless confetti. "What are you doing?" Alexander gasped, stepping forward. "That was your freedom." "I don't want your blood money, Alexander," Marvis said, her voice echoing off the cold stone walls with a strength that stopped him in his tracks. "And I don't want a life where I have to forget you. I'm not staying for the mansions, the gowns, or the billionaire lifestyle. I'm staying for the man who dropped his mask on our wedding night. I'm staying for the man who cried against my shoulder because he was tired of being a monster." The shocking truth hung in the air, more powerful than any weapon in his arsenal. Alexander realized that he hadn't bought her loyalty. He had earned it through the very vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She wasn't an innocent girl trapped by a contract. She was a woman who had seen the broken soul behind the ink and decided it was worth saving. In that moment, the Ice King didn't feel powerful because of his money or his guns. He felt powerful because, for the first time in 46 years, he was loved for exactly who he was. We are so glad you're following this journey. To help us grow our community, tell us in the comments. What city or country are you watching from right now? The sound of tires screeching on gravel erupted outside, followed by the heavy thud of boots surrounding the perimeter. The park syndicate had arrived. Red and blue lights flickered through the high, narrow windows of the safe house, cutting through the darkness like jagged blades. Alexander stood in the center of the room, his silhouette tall and terrifying against the dim light. He checked his weapon with a rhythmic, lethal precision, his face settling into a mask of cold fury that would have made a devil tremble. He looked at the back exit, the narrow tunnel that led to the docks. "The guards will take you through the passage," he said, his voice as cold as a winter grave. "I'm going out the front. I'll give them the fight they came for while you disappear." It was a suicide mission. He planned to become a human shield, taking on an entire army alone just to buy her a few minutes of safety. He turned to leave, but he didn't even make it 2 steps. Marvis moved like a flash of lightning, stepping directly in front of the heavy steel door. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a girl who needed saving. She stood tall, her chin tilted up, blocking his path with a defiance that stopped him cold. "Move, Marvis," he growled, though his eyes were pleading. "There is no time for this." "You told me that our wedding night changed everything," she said, her voice steady and echoing with authority. "You said it changed you. Well, it changed me too, Alexander. I'm not the innocent, frightened girl you kidnapped and forced into a car. I'm the woman who looked into the eyes of the most feared man in Seoul and saw his heart." She stepped closer, the heat of her presence forcing the Ice King to melt just an inch. "I am the woman who owns the man they all fear. If you think I'm going to run away while my husband throws his life away, you don't know me at all." Alexander's breath hitched. He was used to people running from him or begging for their lives, but he had never had anyone fight for him. Marvis reached out and picked up his discarded overcoat from a nearby chair. She stepped into his personal space, sliding the heavy fabric over his broad shoulders. As she straightened the collar, her fingers lingered on his chest, right over his beating heart. It wasn't a gesture of fear, it was a mark of possession. "Go out there and end this," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his with a fierce, burning love. "But don't you dare leave me behind. This is a silent command, Alexander. Come back to me." For a second, the ruthless boss disappeared, replaced by a man who finally had something worth living for. He gave her a single, sharp nod, his hand covering hers on his chest for one final heartbeat. Then, he turned toward the door, not as a man looking for death, but as a warrior coming home. The world outside the safe house exploded into a symphony of violence. Through the thick walls, Marvis heard the rhythmic thunder of gunfire and the jagged shattering of glass. Alexander didn't fight like a man with a death wish. He fought like a man who finally had a reason to survive. He moved through the storm of lead with the ferocity of a king protecting his throne, his every movement calculated and lethal. He was no longer just a boss defending territory. He was a husband clearing a path back to the woman who held his soul. The confrontation was short, sharp, and brutal. When the final echoes of the conflict died down, a heavy, ringing silence settled over the gravel courtyard. The Park Syndicate's ambition had been buried under the weight of Alexander's wrath. As the clouds above finally broke, a cold, cleansing rain began to fall, washing the copper scent of blood from the pavement. Alexander stood in the middle of the clearing, his chest heaving, his expensive suit ruined and soaked through. He looked up at the gray sky, the rain matting his hair to his forehead, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. For the first time in his life, the victory didn't feel hollow. It felt like a bridge. Inside, Marvis waited. She hadn't moved from the spot where she had commanded him to return. When the door finally groaned open, she saw him, a dark, drenched figure framed by the silver light of the moon. Alexander didn't say a word. He didn't boast of his victory or check his wounds. The heavy metal of his handgun clattered to the floor as he dropped it by the entrance, a silent signal that the war was over. He walked toward her, his boots leaving damp prints on the cold floor, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. When he reached her, he didn't wrap her in a cinematic embrace. Instead, his knees buckled slightly, and he leaned into her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was 46 years old, a man who had built an empire on fear, yet here he was, collapsing under the sheer weight of his own relief. Marvis wrapped her arms around his broad, shaking shoulders. She could feel the cold rain on his skin and the frantic, hammering beat of his heart against her chest. He breathed her in, the scent of vanilla and home, letting the warmth of her presence pull him back from the edge of the darkness. There was no need for a grand speech or a confession of love. The emotional climax was written in the way he let go of his pride and let her hold the full weight of his world. In that quiet bunker, the weird girl who saw beauty in cracks and the cold boss who lived in shadows found a language that needed no words. They were two broken pieces that finally fit together, creating a masterpiece out of the wreckage of their lives. Alexander wasn't the Ice King anymore, and Marvis wasn't his captive. They were simply two souls who had survived the night, ready to face the dawn together. The golden hour in Seoul was different now. The sun didn't just set, it melted over the sprawling Hyun estate like liquid honey, coating the world in a warm, protective glow. In the heart of the estate lay a massive, wild garden, a vibrant sanctuary of orchids and jasmine that Marvis had planted with her own hands. It was a living testament to how life could bloom even in the shadow of a fortress. Alexander Hyun sat on a stone bench, watching the petals dance in the breeze. At 52, the sharp, jagged edges of his soul had been smoothed by years of peace, though the power in his gaze remained as piercing as a diamond. He no longer wore the charcoal suits of a wartime boss. Today, his sleeves were rolled up, revealing the tattoos that once stood for death, but now served only as a history book of a life he had outgrown. He watched Marvis as she moved through the flowers. At 25, she was no longer the girl he had taken in the middle of a rainy night. She was a woman of breathtaking confidence, her bold spirit having matured into a grace that commanded more respect than 1,000 guards. She turned, her dark skin glowing in the amber light, and caught him staring. She always caught him. "You look like you're plotting something, Alexander," she teased, her voice a melodic contrast to the heavy silence of his past. He reached out, his hand finding hers with the magnetic precision of a man who had spent 6 years memorizing her every touch. He pulled her gently onto his lap, his arms wrapping around her with a possessiveness that was no longer a cage, but a harbor. The scent of vanilla and blooming jasmine swirled around them, intoxicating and thick with memory. "I was thinking about the beginning," Alexander whispered, his lips brushing against her ear. The air between them hummed with a romantic intensity that had only grown deeper with every passing season. "Do you remember that night, Marvis? The night the world thought I had broken you?" Marvis smiled, a playful yet deeply emotional spark in her eyes. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, tracing the ink on his neck with a soft finger. "You mean the night you realized you couldn't live another second without me?" Alexander let out a low, soft laugh that vibrated against her chest. He looked at her with a gaze so raw and filled with devotion that it felt like a physical weight. "No," he replied, his voice dropping to a vulnerable velvet. "I was thinking about the night I finally started living. The night I realized that the Ice King was just a ghost, and you were the only thing that was real." He kissed her then, a slow, deep, and lingering kiss that tasted of survived storms and promised tomorrows. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander's eyes drifted toward the dark gates of the estate. A black car was idling in the distance, its headlights flickering twice. A new shadow was moving in the city, and a sealed envelope sat on the garden table, bearing a crest Alexander hadn't seen since his father's death. The empire was safe, but the past was never truly buried. He tightened his grip on Marvis, a silent promise in his eyes. He had learned how to live for her, and if the shadows returned, he would show them exactly how a man protects his heaven. What an incredible journey for Alexander and Marvis. Do you think the secret from Alexander's past will return to haunt them, or is their love truly unbreakable? Let us know your theories in the comments below. If you loved this cinematic finale, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next breathtaking story.